This message comes from NPR sponsor Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where hundreds of researchers make new discoveries inspired by the work of previous Dana-Farber scientists. Learn more about their momentum at danafarber.org/everywhere.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. A lot of people call what you're talking about in that sense, like quote unquote race neutral alternatives for decision making. What do you all think about that term, race neutral alternatives?
Zach shaking his head.
It's worth thinking a little bit about where this term is coming from.
After the Supreme Court banned affirmative action in 2023, many have been curious to see how the ruling would affect college admissions, particularly as it pertains to race.
The worry was, okay, you get rid of programs that used race in admissions, then you're going to see the percentage of Black students, the percentage of Hispanic students go down, and the number of white students go up.
But that didn't happen. Not exactly.
What we've seen in states that have banned affirmative action is that some schools have basically no effect in terms of their Black and Hispanic enrollment due to a cascade effect. So UC Berkeley doesn't have an affirmative action program. They might not get into Berkeley, but they're still going to go to college somewhere. And so if you look at the least selective schools, they actually gain in Black and Hispanic enrollment.
Now, some of this was already in the works. For example, places like Yale University have been steadily increasing their Black and Latino student enrollment for years. And while there has been some expected decline at some institutions like Amherst and MIT, I was shocked to learn that there were some cases where Black and Latino enrollment either stayed the same or went up. And that hasn't gone unnoticed. As a part of the Trump administration's policy to end DEI, over 50 schools are being investigated for alleged racial discrimination against white and Asian students.
The majority of those, 50-plus universities are being investigated over a program called the PhD Project, which basically helps doctoral students who are underrepresented get PhDs. This small nonprofit has helped about 1,700 people get PhDs. And so I think that there is a really big concern that even these small programs, these are all on the table and ripe for investigation. And I think that is really going to have even more of a chilling effect on institutions going forward.
At the same time, Harvard just announced that it'll make tuition free for families with income under $200K as a way to make it more accessible. And that made me wonder. As DEI initiatives are being shut down and hefty legal fines threaten long-standing endowments, why do some of these schools seem to be getting more inclusive? And more importantly, how are they doing this without racial demographic data? To find out, I'm joined by NPR's Alyssa Nadworny.
Excited to be here.
And labor economist Zach Bleemer.
Hey, thanks for having us.
To get into the mysterious world of college admissions and how higher education is finding its way around an upended system.
They glean so much information from what I perceived as such little data. And I think maybe this gets to your question of what are the theories of how they could do this without specifically asking for race.
Yeah.
They knew about which high schools and where they were. They knew zip codes. They had tools that showed them maybe income data or demographic data just based on the name of the high school or the name of the town that this person came from. And so they're good at building a whole narrative over just the teeny pieces.
One theory that I've seen is that, schools figured out that socioeconomic status could be used as a proxy signifier for race. According to the Department of Labor, Black folks, for example, make about 76 cents to a white person's dollar. In what ways does socioeconomic status show up in the admissions process?
So admitting students on the basis of parental income is a lot more expensive than admitting students on the basis of race for schools that are trying to provide financial aid to meet or get close to meeting students' financial need as defined by a federal expected family contribution.
And can I jump in and just say, what you mean by that, Zach, is it's more expensive to admit someone who needs a lot more money to go to your college. The school has to actually fill the gaps that student needs. Whereas like race, if it's not connected to income, is like not more expensive or less expensive.
And the reason these things aren't so closely paired to each other is that when it comes to academic preparation, they're kind of additive in the way they contribute to student preparation. So what I mean by that is if you're lower income, you have lower SAT scores than if you're higher income. That's true overall, but it's also true within race. So if you just look at Black applicants to college, lower income Black applicants have much lower test scores than higher income Black applicants. And so if you just target race, you tend to get middle income and at some schools higher income Black and Hispanic students because the lower income Black and Hispanic students have even lower test scores, and providing a bump just on the basis of race won't be enough for those kids. On the flip side, when you target just on the basis of income, you tend to get lower income white and Asian students because the lower income Black and Hispanic students tend to have even lower test scores, and the bump isn't sufficient for them.
I mean, and of course, every student, regardless of race or socioeconomic status, has the capacity to learn, to achieve, to do well, and what have you in college. But what you're saying is that these are some ways that policy affects who's getting admitted to college.
And so you sort of end up with different groups under these two different policies, but also race-based affirmative action tends to bring in middle income or sometimes upper income students who need much less financial aid than the lower income white and Asian students who tend to get pulled in by class-based affirmative action.
That's fascinating.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, you giving me so much to think about with that.
Yeah.
Gosh. Some people have called what you're talking about, even specifically looking at income or zip codes or high schools or whatnot. A lot of people have called what you're talking about in that sense, like quote unquote race neutral alternatives for decision making. What do you all think about that term, race neutral alternatives?
Zach shaking his head.
It's worth thinking a little bit about where this term is coming from. You have to already think that the appropriate way for universities to conduct admissions is by SAT scores and grades and academic preparation at both public and private universities. You have to think that we have these amazing public and private university resources in the U.S. Like you said, they can really change kids' lives. And so, which kids should we give those to? Well, one group of kids we could give them to are the kids who did really well in high school. Mm-hmm. Something people noticed when they started implementing those policies in the 1960s is there just weren't that many Black and Hispanic and lower income and otherwise disadvantaged kids who were super high performing in high school. And affirmative action came from an interest in maintaining some notion of representation while also trying to provide greater educational resources to kids who were thought to be able to best take advantage of them.
Got it. So affirmative action is asking how to go beyond test scores and include some additional strong candidates that might be able to benefit from higher education.
Now that race-based affirmative action is unavailable to universities, you might think that there are alternative and, like you said, sort of race-neutral means by which universities could try to fulfill the same end. They have an interest in targeting the most academically prepared students, but they also want to keep their doors open from kids from every background. And so states that have guaranteed admission to top students from every high school in the state, even if they're relatively lower testing. Texas has this, California, Florida, Georgia all have similar programs. Actually, the SUNY system in New York is just about to start such a program. Mm-hmm. Schools that have gone test optional or, in California's case, test blind. These are all ways of trying to provide opportunity to kids who really didn't have the opportunity to be the highest performing high school students.
Coming up,
I think we're starting to see colleges who were kind of saying, we believe in what we're doing, we believe in this, say, well, we're going to take a harder look and make sure we're in line.
The legal costs of trying to maintain diversity initiatives in higher education and beyond.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Betterment, the automated investing and savings app. CEO Sarah Levy shares why they provide tools and technology for retail investors, small businesses, and independent investment advisors.
At Betterment, there is one unifying idea, which is the idea of expanding access. Historically, great financial advice was reserved for the wealthy, and what technology has done is basically lowered the barrier to entry and created an on-ramp for people earlier in their financial journey to get access to great advice. The same is true for small businesses, where mid and small-sized businesses have not historically been able to afford a retirement solution for their employees. So again, Betterment's technology allows smaller and smaller companies to attract the best employees. And then lastly, for financial advisors, what we've done again is expanded access by automating and using the scale that technology can provide.
Learn more at Betterment.com. Investing involves risk. Performance not guaranteed.
This message comes from Carvana. Sell your car the convenient way. Enter your license plate or VIN, answer a few questions, and get a real offer in seconds. Go to Carvana.com today.
This message comes from Betterment. When investing your money starts to feel like a second job, Betterment steps in with a little work-life balance. Their automated investing and savings app handles your money, constantly being diversified and optimized so you can focus on what matters most. Because your money doesn't need a work-life balance, you do. Make your money hustle with Betterment. Get started at Betterment.com. Investing involves risk. Performance not guaranteed.
So I want to introduce some more complexity into the situation here. There's this man, Edward Bloom. He's the head of Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA, and was also the plaintiff in the Supreme Court case that ended affirmative action. And he has already threatened to sue Yale, Princeton, and Duke for using what he calls race-neutral alternatives to affirmative action, basically claiming these institutions are still achieving diversity in admissions using other signifiers and that is illegal. But legality aside, why? Why would an elite university put themselves in the position to be investigated? Like, why might an admissions office or admissions officers still pursue diversity if it puts them at legal risk?
Okay, I guess first I'll say colleges feel very strongly about their principles, their values, their mission statement, their position in our society. I mean, I think that runs really deep for a lot of these, especially elite institutions. There's this sense of this is our function in American society, and it's to increase diversity of thought, diversity of campus, And there is a fair amount of research showing the benefits of diversity on campus. So a lot of colleges kind of have that imbued into what they offer to students. There was some research that showed about 45% of adults were in favor of ending DEI. But when you broke that down and looked at like young adults, it was the opposite. They disagreed. They supported DEI. And so some of that is like their pitch to students, their identity, kind of like what they represent.
Interesting.
I really think it's worth distinguishing here between public and private universities.
Yeah, please do.
When you look at a school like UCLA, which is in a state where over half of high school graduates are Hispanic, but race-based affirmative action has been illegal in California since 1998, it's unreasonable for the university to implement an admissions policy that just shuts doors disproportionately for students who now make up the majority of the state of California. And so I think public universities have long felt a direct part of their mission is representation of their state, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of geography and class and any kind of student background. And any large gaps between the high school graduating population and the students on campus reflect badly, university administrators think, because they suggest that the California population that has invested in and built UCLA is not, as a whole, deriving UCLA's benefits.
Okay, but what about private universities? Why would they implement these policies?
Why private universities would implement these policies is very much up to the private university. So just to pull two examples, one university you already mentioned is Northwestern, a second is Georgetown. And there's no reason for Northwestern and Georgetown to have even overlapping missions in the sense that Northwestern is sort of typical of many private universities in the U.S. It is effectively owned and managed by alumni and donors to the university. And it's admitting whichever students it thinks best serve the private missions of that institution. Georgetown is a Jesuit university. It's owned by the church. And its mission might have nothing to do with, for example, perpetuating alumni wealth or promoting alumni activities on campus. It might. It's allowed to do whatever it wants, except for admit students on the basis of race.
I mean, there's also, in this whole conversation, there is an elephant in the room. And yes, I am talking about Republicans, specifically the president and his administration's campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, both within the federal government, but also in education. We know that Trump wants to disband the Department of Education. He recently laid off, I think, over 1,000 department employees, and plans to use the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division to go after private and public companies that explicitly or implicitly uphold DEI in some capacity. I think I just saw this morning that the Trump administration was planning to go after, I think, 50 colleges and universities specifically on the grounds of DEI.
Yep, more than 50 universities are being investigated by the Department of Education. Yep.
Yes. How does this set the stage for a whole new culture battle in higher education? Like a place where questions about the importance of diversity have been debated, since affirmative action started like over 60 years ago.
Well, it's interesting your last question, Brittany, because you said kind of like, why would colleges even put themselves out on the line with the fear of getting investigated? Mm-hmm. It had a different answer like a week ago than it, I think, even does this week.
Wow.
A month ago when the Trump administration put out this memo kind of saying like, no more DEI. I think a number of colleges put out statements saying, unless it becomes law, like we're still going to be behind. Like we still believe in diversity. You did have some quiet offices closing, at University of North Carolina. They closed their DEI office. That's certainly something we've been seeing over time. But I think, honestly, last week, a lot of colleges were more willing, I think, to say, you know what, we believe in this stuff. And just today, I'm hearing from schools with this investigation where it's much scarier now. I think they're far more aware of the legal risk that it's exposing them to. And we've seen in the last week, even, Johns Hopkins, which gets a lot of funding from things like NIH,
right,
laying off 2,000 people. We've seen this back and forth with Columbia University around anti-Semitism and investigations into practices on campus. And those have real consequence. $400 million on the table. That's huge for a university. And I think we're starting to see colleges who were kind of saying, we believe in what we're doing, we believe in this, say, well, we're going to take a harder look and make sure we're in line.
Jeez. I got one last question. What is higher education for?
Well, we've been talking about all of these super selective universities. Fewer than 1% of Americans go to an Ivy League school. There's been massive growth in the public sector. There's been very substantial growth in a for-profit sector. Lots of things have changed over the last 50 years about which universities which students go to. Mm-hmm. It's worth emphasizing that while it is true that over the past 50 or 60 years, college has gotten relatively more stratified. So rich kids are getting relatively greater value from going to college, and poor kids are getting relatively less value from going to college. Very little of that is about university admission. Rich kids have always had far greater access to very high-quality universities. Those universities have gotten better over time, which is to say, the U.S. over the last 40 years has very substantially invested in its flagship public universities and not so much in its local comprehensive universities that enroll the plurality of American college students. But I don't think that the selection across schools is really first order in explaining at a high level what's happening in American higher education, though it's obviously the most politically salient question at the moment. Which kids get to go to these universities that enroll less than 1% of Americans, but whose graduates go on to tremendous success in the U.S.?
Yeah.
I think it's a really, really hard question, Brittany. Honestly, like, what is higher education for? Mm-hmm. I struggle as somebody who covers higher ed to also kind of weigh how important these elite institutions, these highly selective institutions, are in the ecosystem of what to cover. Because as Zach said, the majority of students are not having that experience in America. They're going to community college or they're going to these four-year publics, often like a branch campus or like not a flagship university. And I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind as we think about higher education. And like, what is it for? Is it to help you get a job? Is it to help you support your family? I think those questions are really important. And at the same time, what happens at these elite institutions are what's in movies and what's covered in the news and what the politicians talk about. And you're totally right. It's where people of power come from and where they attend. So I think it's a fascinating question of which I struggle with kind of daily to cover the world of higher ed.
My gosh. Well, Alyssa, Zach, thank you both so much. This was a really informative conversation.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thanks, Brittany.
That was NPR's Alyssa Nadworny and labor economist Zach Bleemer. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by
Alexis Williams.
This episode was edited by
Nina Patak.
Our supervising producer is
Barton Girdwood.
Our executive producer is
Verilyn Williams.
Our VP of programming is
Yolanda Sanguini.
All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luce. Talk soon.
This message comes from PagerDuty. Your business is modern, so why aren't your operations? It's time for an operations intervention. Automate and accelerate critical work with the AI-powered operations platform. Learn more at pagerduty.com. This message comes from City National Bank's Ladder Up Home Loan Grant. Home buyers could receive up to $20,000 that doesn't need to be paid back. Find out more at cnb.com/ladderuphome. City National, here for every stage of the journey. Property must be in a qualifying market in California, New York, or New Jersey. Additional terms and conditions apply. Not all applicants will qualify. Terms are subject to change without notice. City National Bank is an equal housing lender. Member FDIC, NMLS number 536994.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Boll & Branch. Change your sleep with the softness of Boll & Branch's 100% organic cotton sheets. Feel the difference with 15% off your first set of sheets at bollandbranch.com with code NPR. Exclusions apply. See site for details.